It's been a very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope this finds you in good health. So, welcome to yet another episode of Perceptive Learning Zone. And today we will be talking about the recent ongoing conflict between Iran as well as Israel. As for those of you who are following the news would know, and for those of you who are still quite unaware of proceedings, the escalating conflict between Israel and Iran, well, it has reached a dangerous new phase. Let's just say that, yes. It has drawn global attention and it is pushing the United States to the brink of military involvement. And this fighting, it basically began last week when Israel launched a surprise assault on dozens of targets deep inside Iran, including nuclear facilities, and it has already resulted in significant casualties as well as destruction. Now, Israel, it claims to have killed multiple senior Iranian military officials, severely damaging Iran's air defense and asserting aerial superiority. Now, according to Iran's health ministry, at least 224 people have been killed and more than 1,400 individuals have been reported to be injured. Now, retaliatory strikes from Iran, they have claimed the lives of at least 24 civilians in Israel and wounded around 600 others. Key Israeli infrastructure has also been targeted, including the country's largest oil refinery in Haifa Bay. Now, tensions across the Middle East, they are rising following a series of Israeli airstrikes over the weekend, targeting Iranian allied forces in Lebanon, Syria, as well as Iraq. Now, the Israeli government has taken responsibility for at least some of the attacks, particularly those in Syria, while remaining silent on others. And early Monday, three Israeli airstrikes they reportedly hit a base that was belonging to a Palestinian group in the Lebanese town of Qusaya, that is near the Syrian border. Now, this followed incidents in Beirut where two Israeli drones damaged a building that was housing the media office of Iran-backed Hezbollah. Now, one of the drones has exploded midair while the other crashed into the structure. And similar drone attacks were also reported in Iraq and Syria. The Israeli Prime Minister, aka the Butcher of Palestine, Benjamin Netanyahu, has claimed the strike in Damascus was preemptive, intended to thwart a planned drone attack on Israel by Iranian operatives targeting the Golan Heights. And to quote Netanyahu, if someone rises up to kill you, kill him first, unquote, hence affirming Israel's readiness, I would say, to strike Iran or any force using another country's territory to mount attacks on Israel. Now, this war is escalating just when the United States is weighing direct involvement. President Donald Trump has intensified rhetoric around the crisis, demanding Iran's unconditional surrender and alluding to the possible assassination of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who is Iran's supreme leader. Now, in a social media post on Tuesday, Trump has claimed that we know exactly where Khamenei is hiding, but added that we're not going to take him out, at least for now. He also lauded Israel's air dominance, attributing it in part to American military technology. Now, while President Trump has previously voiced opposition to further U.S. involvement in overseas conflicts, the unfolding war may test that stance. And Israeli officials now, as we speak, are using Washington to deploy its massive ordnance penetrator. Now, what is the massive ordnance penetrator for those of you who are uninitiated on this theme? Well, it is ladies and gentlemen, it is a 30,000 pound bunker busting bomb that is capable of targeting Iran's heavily fortified Fordo nuclear site. That is something Israel's own arsenal cannot achieve. Yes. So Iran has reportedly positioned missiles and other weapons for potential strikes on US bases across the region should American forces join the fight. And Intelligence officials now they warn that Tehran is prepared for escalation. And I feel like this adds another layer of urgency to the White House's deliberations. Meanwhile, US military analysts note that a successful strike on Fordo would require multiple waves of B 2 stealth bombers dropping successive massive ordnance penetrators on the same coordinates, highlighting the complexity and risk of any American strike. So you could say that the human trail of the conflict is mounting. Iranian civilians in Tehran and other cities are facing the brunt of Israeli airstrikes, and some neighborhoods have seen residential complexes hit, prompting long lines of cars as residents attempt to flee the capital. Now, the strike on Iran's state television complex, it has sent shockwaves across the city, both literally as well as symbolically. Israeli military officials claim to have eradicated over 120 missile launchers since the campaign began, including hitting key drone and missile infrastructure in western Iran on Tuesday. Um, the scale of leadership losses within Iran's military ranks is staggering, to say the least. Israeli attacks have killed at least 11 senior generals, including Major General Mohammad Bagheri, the commander in chief of Iran's military. Then you have General Hossein Salami, the head of the Revolutionary Guards. Then you have General Ghulam Ali Rashid, who was the deputy commander of the armed forces. Iran's supreme leader had quickly appointed Major General Ali Shadmani to replace Rashid, only for Shadmani to be killed days later in another Israeli strike. The top political official overseeing Iran's nuclear negotiations with the US, Ali Shamkhani, was also killed last Friday. In addition, Iran has reportedly assassinated two prominent nuclear scientists and struck the headquarters of the elite Quds Force in Tehran. So, in Israel, Iranian missile attacks continue to target cities and strategic sites. A barrage on Monday killed at least 8 people and injured nearly 100 more in central cities like Tel Aviv and Haifa. The Israeli military is calling on citizens to remain in their shelters until further notice, with aerial defenses stretched thin under the sustained assault. So, though Israel has invested heavily in multi layered defense systems, officials say that the scale and sophistication of Iran's missile response is testing their limits. And tensions, ladies and gentlemen, are also escalating in the Middle East amidst the Israeli airstrikes and Iranian retaliation threats. These developments have sparked sharp responses from both Iran as well as Hezbollah. Now, an Iranian government spokesman labeled the Israeli actions as shameless violations of sovereignty and warned of a forthcoming response. The Hezbollah leader, Hassan Nasrallah, called the drone attacks in Lebanon a very dangerous development, stating that Israeli aircraft would no longer be allowed to operate in Lebanese airspace without resistance. And Nasrallah promised retaliation, warning that Israeli drones entering Lebanon would be crushed. Also in Tel Aviv, you have Seth Frantzman, a Middle East analyst at the Jerusalem Post, who noted that while some of the recent strikes are only alleged, Israel openly claims responsibility for Syria operations. And sorry, he said that Israel's actions are part of a consistent strategy that is aimed at preventing Iran and its proxies from entrenching along Israel's borders, especially near ceasefire lines. Frantzman is also emphasizing that Netanyahu's security stance is broadly supported across Israel's political spectrum, including by opposition parties, and that his posture may not be purely electoral, though the country is heading into an election in September. Most Israelis trust Netanyahu on security issues given his decade-long track record. Then in Tehran, you have Mohammad Marandi, who is an Iranian political analyst and professor at the University of Tehran. He has dismissed Netanyahu's justification for the strikes as disinformation. Marandi is arguing that Israel rarely targets actual Iranian soldiers and accused it of striking Syrian government positions under the pretext of targeting Iran. He challenged Israel to provide evidence of Iranian casualties if their claim is true. Marandi is also alleging that Israel has a history of aiding, facilitating, backing extremist groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda near the Golan Heights. And he is referencing an interview by a former Mossad chief that suggested Israeli cooperation with the Al Qaeda linked groups. And he claimed that Israel's allies across the region, including Hezbollah, the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, as well as the Syrian government, they are not proxies, but ideological and strategic partners. Also, you have Sami Hamdi, who is the editor in chief of the National Interest Journal, suggesting that the strikes are part of a broader geopolitical struggle that is involving the US, Israel, and the Gulf states like the UAE and the Saudi Arabia against Iran. He's pointing out the consistent pattern of violence before Israeli elections, with Netanyahu historically using external threats to unify domestic opinion. And also, Hamdi asserted that the airstrikes are not simply about tactical gains, but are intended, I would say, they are intended to weaken Iran's regional influence, especially as the Trump administration resists being drawn into direct military conflict. He is describing the situation as a regional Cold War where everyone wants the US to do the fighting, but Washington is increasingly unwilling. And returning to the topic of ideological violence, Hamdi and Marandi, they both contested the framing of Iran's role in the region as purely sectarian or revolutionary. Marandi highlighted Iran's support for Sunni populations in Palestine and Bosnia as proof that its alliances are not based on sectarianism, while Hamdi emphasized that Iran's grassroots ideological appeal set it apart from transactional relationships that are fostered by the Saudi Arab and UAE. Marandi is also further arguing that Iran's resilience under US sanctions, despite economic difficulties, it demonstrates the failure of the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign. Now, on whether the current spike in violence could spiral into an all out war, Franceman cautioned that while neither Iran nor Israel desires a major conflict, we all know that miscalculations could easily trigger an escalation. And this Hamdi is echoing the sentiment, suggesting that Hezbollah may not immediately retaliate with force, instead leveraging the rhetoric to maintain deterrence. However, Marandi countered that retaliation is likely, especially in light of Nasrullah's vow to respond to Israeli violations of Lebanese sovereignty. And he reiterated that Iran does not seek war, but will respond decisively to aggression. And amidst all this, it is interesting to note, dear viewers, that Russia is walking a diplomatic tightrope. What am I talking about? You see, ladies and gentlemen, as the war between Israel and Iran intensifies, Russia is finding itself in a complex diplomatic bind. It is forced to balance its long-standing alliance with Tehran against its pragmatic ties with Israel. And following Israel's initial strikes on Iranian military and nuclear sites, Moscow had condemned the offensive as unprovoked military strikes against a sovereign UN member state, and it is calling for a diplomatic resolution. Now, despite the strong rhetoric, analysts suggest that Russia is unlikely to escalate its involvement or provide direct military support to Iran. You see, Russia and Iran have shared a strategic partnership, particularly through their joint support for former Syrian President Bashar al-Assad during the civil war. And more recently, Iran has supplied Russia with Shahid drones and short-range ballistic missiles, which are being currently used and deployed in Ukraine in real time. However, you see, military cooperation, it appears to have limits. Independent analyst Ruslan Soleimanov emphasized that while Iran may have hoped for more advanced Russian military technology or greater support, Moscow has been cautious, avoiding any direct arms transfer that could provoke a conflict with Israel. Um, Russian officials and commentators have expressed ideological support for Iran's position. Hardline TV personality Sergei Martin noted that, quote, since Israel is a key ally of the United States, of course we are interested in the weakening of Israel and in helping its adversaries, unquote. Nonetheless, that being said and done, ladies and gentlemen, official Kremlin policy has stopped short of direct military action, with Moscow keen to avoid undermining its own interests in maintaining stable relations with Israel, a country it has cooperated with tacitly in Syria and avoided antagonizing over Ukraine. So it's not wrong to say that the relationship between Russia and Israel is multifaceted. While the two countries have historically had divergent priorities in Syria, Russia supporting the Assad regime and Israel targeting Iranian backed forces, there was one significant tactical coordination to avoid military friction. However, that being said and done, the recent collapse of Assad's regime has reduced Moscow's need for Israeli cooperation in the region. Despite past cordial relationships between President Vladimir Putin and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, including public appearances together, those ties may now be tested by the shifting strategic landscape. Some analysts, they opine, they feel that Russia sees the Israel Iran conflict as an opportunity to position itself as a neutral mediator. Putin has already extended an offer to broker peace with experts like Alexei Melenin, arguing that Russia is, and I quote, one of the platforms most open to compromise due to constructive relations with both countries, unquote. Yet others like Suleimanov are skeptical of Moscow's influence, noticing that Kremlin has been stretched thin by its war in Ukraine and its diminished standing in the Middle East following Assad's downfall. At the same time, the Kremlin may view potentially the growing crisis as a geopolitical distraction that benefits its own agenda. With global attention shifting from Ukraine to the Middle East, Putin may see a window for advancing military operations in Eastern Europe while Western support is redirected towards Israel. Malenin suggested this could lead to a short term drop in aid to Kiev, though he cautioned against expecting any major strategic shift in that regard. So, to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, as tensions arise, the international community watches closely. And with diplomatic options narrowing and hostilities intensifying, the United States faces a critical choice whether to intervene in a full scale war that could reshape the Middle East potentially. So, as the Israeli election is approaching, Netanyahu's hardline security posture remains a cornerstone of this campaign. However, when this strategy will secure him the necessary support, whether it will do so, only time will tell. It remains uncertain for now, because especially when you see that the opposition's security views are largely aligned with his. So all parties agree that while open conflict is undesirable, the region it remains on edge, balanced precariously between calculated deterrence as well as a risk of uncontrolled escalation. So ultimately, while Russia remains rhetorically aligned with Iran and committed to opposing US Israeli dominance in the region, its actions suggest a careful balancing act. And Moscow is unlikely to jeopardize its relationship with Israel or invite further international scrutiny by arming Iran directly. Instead, it appears to be pursuing limited diplomatic influence while watching from the sidelines as events in the Middle East unfold. We can only pray to God to help us get through in these testing times and feel for the families of those who have passed away in this conflict. That'll be all for now, fellas. We'll be back with more enthralling episodes. Please don't hesitate to show our support for the channel, and take care of yourself and have a lovely evening. Assalamu alaikum.